yeah, let me go ahead and start recording. So what I'm going to go through today is how to, let me rephrase that. Feel free to follow along. You probably will be able to keep up. Don't expect that the thing that you get out of the other end of this is going to be your assignment. You're probably going to have to redo parts of this because it's so easy to break stuff. So I'm just going to create a new one here in my, where am I at? PC. Sure. We'll call this pendulum creates. Okay. So everybody remembers the pendulum from Animation Fundamentals if you took that class. If you didn't take that class, the pendulum was essentially a, I have some videos of it up here, right? Do what? Yeah, it was harder than it should have been. It was a project. Let me go back to some old ones here. The pendulum project was basically Catherine. It was yours. Catherine did one in 3D. So we'll use Catherine since she's in here. It was this, right? It's so old. It was your masterpiece.
It was when I was excited about the camera.
Yeah.
Whoa, hot diggity dog.
Hot diggity dog. What did Catherine Ross do? Yeah, she did. So basically, it was this idea of learning how to use overlapping action. But it's a very simple rig, right? We have a platform that has several pieces that are sort of suspending from below it, right? Okay. Now, it would be relatively easy to go ahead and create. I have 2 of these. Oh, I got that one. It's close now. So it would be relatively easy to create that as a drawing 1 frame at a time, right? Except for that's a lot of tedium, and that's not really something that needs to be redrawn over and over again. So I wanted to talk to you about alternative ways in which we can get animation using rigging. So I'm actually just going to save this one. Before I do that, I'm just actually going to open up some of my older stuff so we can look at it really quick, right? So like my Dragon class, the first day, is this where we did the, what is this?
I think it's ball animation.
Is it the ball animation? Let's see if it opens it, maybe. There we go, today. All right, I have a better animation than that. So that's what I'm wanting to get is the ball animation. So, Marlowe, Dragon class, bouncing ball, and I'll just get that. Okay. So we've looked at this for quite a while now. Let me go ahead and make this a cycle really quick. So Control C, and then I'll paste this as a cycle. I'll paste it 9 times. That sounds great. Okay. Hopefully at this point, you are familiar with what is happening here, right? We have one layer, and this layer, or one animation layer, and this animation layer has multiple drawing exposures on it, right? And so we know that like if I needed to move one of these, right? I was talking about like your easing, right? Let's say my easing wasn't working right on this frame. We all know that I can go in here and select these drawing elements and I can move those around, right? But what I'm doing is I'm moving those drawing elements around on my drawing page, right? And so that's, just kind of keep that in your head. That's what's happening is I'm moving the strokes, the color, the line. I'm moving those within the drawing space, right? So what is important and why this is, I need to hide you, go away. Why this is a powerful tool is I also have the ability to move the entire layer, right? So this layer right now has that ball bouncing up and down, right? I have the ability to move where that's happening. Now we saw earlier that I can move all of the drawings, but that's permanent, right? If I move those, they stay moved. These tools across the top are what we're going to be looking at, particularly these three. We have a translate, rotate, scale, right? Let's click the translate. And what you'll see is I get this little arrow right in the middle of our scene here, right? Now it's very easy to imagine that this arrow represents this ball. What I'm doing is I'm moving that ball. But I'm not. I'm actually moving that layer. So if I move this, I can move my layer around wherever I want to. Now be careful not to grab this center point because that's me just changing the pivot point for it. So if you grab one of the arrows and you move it over, you'll see a couple of things happen. I get this little dot on my timeline there, and the ball moved over, but the entire animation of the ball moved over. Right? Now, that little dot that we're seeing there, let's go ahead and move it over there again. That is a keyframe. So, I guess to think about this, the terms that we use in 2D animation and 3D animation for software, like keyframing or in-betweening, right, are derived from traditional animation. And people would use phrases like keyframing interchangeably with multiple different concepts. So we may be talking about drawing a key frame or drawing an essential frame of your animation, right? But what this is a keyframe for tweening, right? This is just like in Maya, how Maya thinks of a keyframe. It's a marker on time on some values. And those values that I'm setting a marker on time for are on the layer, not the ball. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I go out here to the end of my animation and I move that layer over to here, right, you're going to see it gives me another keyframe and it connects them with a line. Now, all of those drawings are the same, but if I hit play now it's going to bounce across the screen. Okay, so what I have the ability to do is animate the placement, the rotation, the scale, even the skew, and several other features of my entire layer, right? So you can do the same thing with your character jumping right now. If you wanted to make your character slowly jump across your screen, all of those drawings you did, that layer is just going to slide across the screen. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So, there's a lot of different ways that we can think about animating inside of Toon Boom. One of the ways is what I just did, right? I have a whole bunch of drawings that are all being exposed on one timeline, and I can move that entire layer. Now, another thing I could do is I could make one drawing, and I could move it across my timeline in so many dynamic ways that I would still get another bouncing ball. So let me kind of show you a rough idea of what I'm talking about. I went ahead and hid this, right? Go back to the beginning. I'm going to create a new layer here. A drawing layer, sure. Good, close. I'm going to use my ellipse tool, and I'm going to draw a circle. I will go ahead and fill that circle. And so I now have this drawing, and I'll just call this ball. Nope, I already have one called ball. So we'll call this ball 2. And I can extend this all the way out here to the end, F5. So if I go look at my move tool is over here. I could pivot, or I could position this to say like right here. And I could go ahead and sort of move it a little bit to make sure we set a keyframe. I think the other shortcut key to set a keyframe is F6. So that's going to set a keyframe on everything. And I could go ahead and set that on, say, frame there. So I got 2 keyframes up at the top. I could set one in the middle. ball is down here, and then I could sort of squash it like that, scale it like that. And so now I can start building my original bouncing ball again just by manipulating this. So, this is sort of the other way we've done this. I've not done, and this is very sloppy, very quick, right? But I've not done multiple drawings that are each being exposed frame by frame on my layer. I've done one drawing, and I've exposed it for the entire timeline, and then I'm shifting that drawing around. I'm manipulating or warping that drawing to get some animation. This is probably a little more familiar to what you're used to in 3D animation, right? That you have something that's sort of prefabricated for you, and you can manipulate that. So there's some elements that, obviously this has like a different feel to it than this, right? And this has a lot more work to do, but you can sort of see that, you can sort of see the differences in them, right? One feels a little bit more mechanical because they're being drawn, or they're being created with the computer. The other elements, I've just drawn them over and over again, so they feel a little bit more alive, but that took way more time, right? The amount of time to draw each of those frames is way more than drawing one frame and just moving it, right? Now, I also know that some people don't like 3D animation because of the graph editor. Right? The graph editor is something that just annoys them. And I know that some people sometimes hope that they're going to do 2D animation so they don't have to use the graph editor. That's not how this works. There's a graph editor in here as well. So let's look at that. One of the first things to notice is on this layer, this ball 2 layer, right, if I go to my layer properties, now if you don't have this open, you just click the little plus button, find layer properties in here and make sure you turn them on. You'll notice that I have this node here where it says 3D path or separate. Make sure separate is checked on, but it should be for a drawing layer by default. There are some layers that it's not. So if that's the case, if those are checked on, then I can go in here to my timeline, I usually do it down here, and click the little plus button and go to function. Now, it'll bring up this graph. Now, nothing's on it until I go back here and select the ball again for some reason. And when I come back, you're going to see that I start getting a graph. Now, this graph editor does not work as smoothly as Maya's graph editor, but it does work. So you'll see that what we have is, yes?
Where's how do you get the graph editor again?
So you click the little plus button to add a menu, and it's called function. So people have a tendency to call this the function graph, like it's the, like if you are using a graphing calculator, like the function graph. And if you choose function, it may bring up an empty graph. The way you get something on it is to go to your timeline and choose the layer that has some keyframes on it, and then go back to your function graph and you'll be able to see it. Now, you'll see with this that a couple of things. I can click this button right here. It'll sort of normalize the view. This button will also kind of reset the view vertically. Like there's a couple of different things in here that you kind of help you sort of reset your view. But you can also scroll in and out with your mouse wheel. And you'll see we have a couple of things in here. We have position X, position Y, position Z, and all of those are checked on. We have some other things in here like scale X and Y and angle Z. Angle Z is really your rotation, right? If you think of that as like the only rotation you really get. And then skew is like a feature as well. So let's figure out which one we need here. It's probably going to be position Y, so up and down, right? Now, using the graph editor in here is a little clunky because immediately you don't have any tangents. The way you get tangents in this is to change this from corner to smooth and change this to your easing. Right? So you just sort of pick an easing you want. So for me, if I do that, like I start getting these little arrows in here. And so again, like changing this to smooth usually gives you those little tangents that you can pull and adjust. So now if I look at the way that animation looks, it looks a little bit better. Oh. So it's got a little bit more squash, a little bit more stretch, but it's definitely got some control of that easing in and out. Now I know I went through that pretty quick. Don't sweat it, because you're like everything else. The way you're going to have to kind of get used to this is by trying it. It's not like there's a lot of clicks involved in order to get to your tangent, right? And there's sometimes it's a little frustrating. I fight with this as well because I'm so used to how Maya does it. But this will allow you to control your easing in and your easing out. Now you can also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, control it just by right-clicking here. And I think that there's something, yeah, set ease for multiple parameters. There's also some options to set some ease in a few other places. So is it here? No. Anyway. There's a couple places where we can set the ease just for an individual keyframe without having to look at it in the function editor. But we'll get into that function editor just a little bit more, or more as we go further along. So, this is making sense. Okay. So I'm really just getting that one thumbs up in the back of the room. What about the rest of y'all? Okay. So let's try something a little bit new. Yes?
How often do you have to use that version of Graphic? Or is that just like an option? Is it as useful as the one in mine?
So here's the frustrating thing. Harmony is going to set all of your keyframes to linear. So none of them are going to look good. So you have to use it quite a bit, actually. And that is a little bit frustrating, but it's not that bad. Like actually, I usually will select everything, make sure that we're set to smooth, and then I'll just choose some easing, like something like this that's kind of casual, or kind of like less intense, and then I'll go through and fix the ones that mess up. Right? Unlike the graph editor in Maya, you're probably going to have fewer things that you're actually manipulating, right? So if you think of like a character's hand, you have the FK of the rotations for X, Y, and Z, maybe the translations. You have maybe some controls on all of the fingers and stuff like that. A lot of those details, like you're just going to have fewer curves that you actually have to manipulate. And because it's in 2D, it's like if it doesn't look bad, you don't always have to worry about it, right? Some stuff will look okay linear. So we'll kind of see that as we go along. So for example, we're going to go ahead and do the pendulum here pretty soon, and that will make sense. So 4:24. I'm looking at the time. Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and pause there. Because we only have about 15 minutes left. There's no way I'm getting through creating a pendulum rig, animating all of that for this class period. So what I would like you to do is to play with this a little bit. Like just sometime you get a chance, open up Toon Boom, open up Harmony, create an object, try to animate it moving around the screen, and just mess with the function editor. I'm not going to take any of that up. This is just some practice time for you. In the meantime, in between now and next class period, if you're wanting to be doing any revision on the last project, to be finishing up some of the coloring stuff, that's completely cool. So I do want to show you a couple of things really quick for the people who are having trouble with coloring stuff, because I feel like this is still kind of a complex process. You don't have to color everything in your different color layers here, right? Like, so if you if you have this shape, you have this shape. Right? One has a little bitty hole in it, the other one does not, right? And so most of you have probably already figured out that if I use my fill bucket on this one, it fills it just fine. If I use it on this one, it doesn't, right? So some of that is a property of the tool. So we have this ability to close the gaps, right? And so that one didn't have a gap, so it closes it very easily. But this has a small gap there, and so I can try choosing something like that, maybe something even bigger, and sometimes it will fill it, right? Now sometimes it still won't, right? So if it doesn't, there's a couple of different ways you could fix that. One is you could just get those lines closer together, right? You can go in here, grab that point, kind of do something like that, and then your fill bucket will probably fill it, right? And I know that can be a little bit of a pain in the butt, particularly depending on how you inked your lines, right? So if they're not enclosed shapes, it's going to be really hard to fill it with the fill bucket. Now, something that we had talked about was putting this shape down on the color layer, right? So if I select that and I click this button here, what it does is in my drawing layer on the color, I get this shape, right? But that shape still has that gap in it. Now I can grab that point and drag that a little closer, and then I can still fill that, even though I didn't change the gap in my line layer, right? So I get that. There's also a couple of other tools that will allow you to connect that together. So I'm going to go back a few steps to before so I merge that line down, go to my color line. So if I click here and go to this polyline tool, I can pretty quickly just connect those two together, right? And then I think if I use the fill bucket, it will fill it in fine, right? So there's a couple of other little ways that we can do that. There's also another option in here, I think, to select this and just to, there's a way to like, there's a way to fill these gaps, and I can't remember what that is right now off the top of my head. But that is one way that you can do it is with this little polyline tool. So hopefully that'll help. Worst case scenario, you can always kind of go in and do kind of what Amy did, which is sort of paint in your perimeter and your color line, and just sort of outline the whole thing, like sort of paint around your outline, and then fill bucket in the rest of it. So for example of what I'm talking about there, I'm doing it on my color line. I can get my paintbrush, go in here and just do my color all the way around here. It's way messy. Let's pretend I'm neater than that. All the way around here. And then fill bucket the rest of it. And then you can do a little bit of erasing here and there if you need to get rid of parts of it. Now, I will kind of go back just a little bit to remind you, like, this is a learning experience, right? I know ideally what you're all hoping for is to be able to crank out portfolio quality pieces for every project, right? And that would be awesome. And maybe like what will happen is you, if this one was one that didn't quite hit it for you, you would go back a few steps and rework this one a little bit later once you start to understand it a little bit. Ideally though, for me, these first two projects, really every project, is where you're going to try something you haven't tried before, and just by the nature of it, you're going to mess it up, right? You're going to have some issues with it. And so I guarantee you by the time you fight with all of the things that you fight with, on getting this, if you decide to color this character, get this character completely colored. The next one you do, you'll think about things as you're working on it, right? You may be thinking about, like, while you're inking your character, oh, I got to remember to close that little gap so it will work better when I'm coloring it next time, right? That's all just part of the process. There's no way you could know everything and keep everything in your head. The way you get to that point is by messing it up a few times. And I for one, am very happy with the results you're getting right now. So keep at that, like keep moving forward with that. I think that this is going to work out pretty well. And what can happen is a few steps down the road, and then you'll look back at it and be like, you know what, I could totally rework that piece and get something really awesome out of it with what I know now. All right, questions, comments, anything? Yes. All right, cool. Rest of the class is yours. Thanks for bearing with me. And I'll upload this video to YouTube here in just a second.